So obviously I am not a field school director yet. Our director, Dr. Charles Adams, couldn't be here today. He had a prior commitment, so he asked me and Claire Barker, who's the other TA, to step in. Claire set out a nice arrangement of artifacts from our field school that you can look at more closely at ASM at the reception. Our co-director, Rich Lang, is also here if you have further questions. He can jump up and correct me if I start to say anything off track. So coming at this from the TA perspective, I feel like it's nice because I have a slightly different approach to the students and a different perspective in relationship with them. We generally fall somewhere between teacher, friend, and babysitter. Spend a lot of my days counting students, making sure no one wandered off over a fence somewhere or fell asleep under a rock, which might sound funny, but we have had both of those things happen at the field school. So you never know. Rock Art Ranch really developed from the homology research program, which unfortunately I can't talk about too much today just due to time. But it was a very active project through ASM run by Chuck and Rich for over 20 years, starting in the 1980s. It really focused on the Pueblo IV occupation around Winslow, Arizona. There's a settlement cluster with 7 sites at which they excavated 6 of these ancestral Hopi villages and did survey of the surrounding area to understand the landscape use. It was never technically a field school, but it ended up training about 100 graduate and undergraduate students throughout its time. Additionally, a number of masters and PhDs were granted through research with the collections, including Dr. Lyons, who you heard from earlier. And Claire and I are both actually working with homology data to do our dissertations currently. Rock Art Ranch itself started in 2011. We've just finished our 5th field season and we have 1 more to go. It became an RU. Barbara mentioned the NSF research experience for undergraduate. It became an RU field school 2 years ago. And we have had about 74 students come through so far. A lot of these students have ended up sticking with archaeology. We have a couple in grad school now. There's a student at UC Boulder and one at the University of New Mexico currently. For the most part, our students have been very intrigued by archaeology. They've been very dedicated. We've been very lucky to have a very enthusiastic group. That being said, a couple students do learn that the desert is in fact very hot, and doing fieldwork in the summer is not necessarily what they had in mind. Most of them just become very creative and very good at finding the little bits of shade available by shoving themselves into the closest juniper tree. To give you a little bit of regional context, Winslow, Arizona is in northeastern Arizona. Maybe you've been there and stood on the corner. The homology sites are all listed up here individually, and then the Rock Art Ranch study area is in blue at the bottom, near the bottom of the screen. This is actually a private property. We work on a privately owned ranch. It takes about 10 to 15 miles of driving on dirt roads, which has resulted in many flat tires, unfortunately. As Diane mentioned, a lot of our students were not necessarily used to changing tires prior to this, and there was a lot of standing around and seeing what Rich would do. Although last summer we luckily had 2 students who had worked in tire shops prior to coming, so anytime anything happened, we all just let them take over. Brantley Barrett is the owner of the ranch. His family's owned the ranch for the last several decades. And he actually is very interested on a personal level in the cultural tourism and preservation as kind of a business model. He runs private tours of his ranch and has set up the barn as kind of a museum. So you can go out and visit if you're in the area and you're willing to brave the roads. We've been able to have a very mutually beneficial relationship with Brantley, in that he's very interested in our help in interpreting and kind of showing him some of the other stuff that he maybe wasn't as aware of from the surface, expanding his knowledge of the area while also he's allowing us to really work on his land. He houses us, they've built cabins and showers, we even have hot water now, and lets us pretty much invade his family's life for 5 weeks every summer with a cadre of 15 undergraduate students. His ranch covers a portion of Chevelin Canyon, which is important for a couple of reasons, mainly in this case because of the permanent water source. It's a very deep canyon, has water year-round, and therefore has a kind of unique riparian habitat. We have different plants and animals than would be found in the rest of the area, making it an interesting point of an important place for communities living in the area. Additionally, within this canyon, we have over 3,000 petroglyphs. Most of these have been recorded by local rock art specialist Darlene Brinkerhoff, who works with us and volunteers on our project as well. And a lot of these are concentrated in an area known as the Steps. It's a place where you can actually walk down and get into the canyon from the top. Most of these date to the Archaic or the Basque-Weaver II early agricultural periods of occupation, which we can do based on some of the features of the hair whorls here. Additionally, we've been surveying, there are two other canyons, one of which Bell Cow offshoots from Chevelin, and another that comes in from the other side of the ranch. These are much more shallow canyons. Chuck did discover that there is water through testing. It just happens to be about over 1.5 meters below the surface. So there is water here. We did learn this summer with the high rainfall that it actually does flow occasionally. We saw plants this summer that we had never seen in our prior work at the ranch, and we have two ethnobotanists, Karen Adams and Susie Smith, come and visit every year, and they were able to identify several new species that we had not been aware grew in the region prior to, or on the ranch prior to this summer. Along this canyon itself, so Bell Cow is the one that kind of flows in down through the center of the map. We identified 8 additional petroglyphs this summer with the students, which they had a great time with. TJ Ferguson actually was out visiting us and found this one at the bottom here when he stopped to drink some water. So it happened to be everywhere. We can date one of them, the one with the figure, to the basket maker period, but most of them are a little difficult to date for us. But we have rock art specialists looking at them. The sites, so far we have discovered 179 sites at Rock Art Ranch. We've been talking a lot about slowing down excavations, but we've managed to slow down the survey to record everything very thoroughly. We've surveyed about 4.5 square miles over 5 seasons, which those of you who've done a lot of survey know that's not a lot of ground to cover. But we have an average of 40 sites per square mile. And these sites range from small lithic scatters to very large basket maker villages with many features and hidden areas. Students get a little exhausted mapping all of this, obviously. Additionally, we found a really, I find to be a somewhat crazy number of projectile points over the summers. We have over 250 so far that date all throughout from Paleo-Indian into the Pueblo period. Students are very excited to find projectile points. It becomes a huge point of competition and bragging rights among the field school. And to be honest, I wanted to throw this picture in here because if you steal my phone to take a selfie in the field, I think I have the right to use it in any public platform I want to in the future. These are just some of the points we found. The two on the top left are both Clovis points that we found this summer. It was very exciting. We had several students who were particularly interested in projectile point technology, and we have a student who was out with us who has been analyzing them in the lab this year and is working on that process. And a lot of these will be out at ASM afterwards if you'd like to come look at them more closely. In terms of location, there's a clear focus along Bell Cow Canyon again throughout these periods. The Clovis points are both, that we found this summer, were both right up along Chevelin Canyon over here. We had one student who won the competition for finding the most projectile points tenfold. And part of this was finding one little catchment right before the edge of Chevelin Canyon that had, I think, 6 projectile points, 3 of which were Paleo-Indian, within about 1 meter. I thought he was lying to me when he kept telling me he found another one. And this kind of focus on the canyons continues throughout the earlier projectile points that we have. Preceramic sites are by far the most common, ranging from archaic to early agriculture. You can see again, Bell Cow Canyon just is the focus of activity, and this is likely due to the riparian habitat, to the diverse plants and animals, it's the location of most of the petroglyphs. Many of our preceramic sites do have features associated with them. These are generally either storage or thermal features. You'll notice there's the one green dot towards the center, and that is the one basket maker 2 pit house that we found underneath while excavating the Pueblo. This pit house had an associated storage feature, an associated bell-shaped pit nearby. So it's very likely that there are other pit houses on the landscape that we just haven't been able to identify dating to this time period. Additionally, we've run about 7 or 8 radiocarbon dates from testing that Chuck has done with some students. When we find some of the ashy features and some of the thermal features, Chuck will go out with a student or 2 and test to try to see if we can get some radiocarbon to date. So far, almost all of these dates put us very firmly throughout the basket maker 2 occupation. There is one very late date that's an exception, but it shows that the use of this area ranges throughout the entire time period. We also added this site on the bottom left is a site called God's Pocket that was excavated in the 1990s by the Huckles. And they had, because it's so close, it was interesting to illustrate that they also had similar dates. They, however, have corn in their thermal feature. We have not found evidence of corn yet, but it doesn't necessarily mean they weren't using it, only that there were other resources in the area that were also being exploited. Groundstone, again, points to this concentration around Bell Cow Canyon and largely to the basket maker 2 period. Interestingly, this map is the one that we've not updated yet, so it will get filled in more soon. Interestingly, we haven't found a ton along Chevelon Canyon. We've found several large preceramic sites with a lot of really early lithics and very little groundstone, kind of coming right up to the edges of these canyons with big drop-offs. And Chuck suspects that this might be due to more of an emphasis on hunting in these locations. Whereas along Bell Cow, we get kind of a lot of basin patates, a lot of one-handed monos, and kind of this focus on gathering and processing of foods. In addition, we've gotten a lot of grinding features along Bell Cow, and this includes anywhere from ones that were kind of laid out, you can see where they were preparing a surface for grinding, to ones that really resemble the basin patates we're finding elsewhere. Throughout later in time, when we get to the basket maker number 1 period, the landscape becomes used more broadly. This is actually the broadest distribution of sites that we have in terms of their location. And here we have an array of kind of scattered sites with features and habitation sites, including 3 very large pit house villages with over 10 pit houses each. And these areas have clearly defined middens, as well as many associated features, lots of pottery, lots of cool stuff there. Very fun to record, very time consuming. And then when we get into the Pueblo 2 and 3 period, we start to see more of a shift towards habitation along Chimney Canyon. And this is where the excavations from the project have come in. We've worked at 2 different sites over the 5 years. In 2011 and 2012, Dr. Vince Lamata, who was a homology research program graduate of the U of A, and now works at the University of Illinois Chicago, directed excavations at REO2 on the ranch, which dates to between 1225 and 1250 based on radiocarbon samples. This is actually an external use area with various features exposed. It's a very small Pueblo, 6 to 8 rooms, with larger room sizes, which seems to suggest it might be linked more southernly to the Maguillon region. And possibly these occupants migrated to Chevelon Pueblo, or one of the Pueblo 4 homology settlement sites. Our second excavation, which has been directed by Rich Lang, is located actually farther south and not on the ranch. It is on state land instead. And it's a larger Pueblo. You can also see in this picture, in the far right in the green, one of our wonderful volunteers, Jay Smith, who's here. Multi-Kiva is a 20 to 30 room Pueblo with a very clearly defined hidden area and 3 depressions along the side, which is hence its name, the Multi-Kiva site. For the first 2 years of excavation, we were a little distraught over the lack of apparent kivas, at the multi-kiva site, as none of the depressions seem to be so. Luckily, after this last summer of excavation, Rich now suspects that structure 102 may be a kiva, and it also appears that the room off to the right, kind of towards the back of the site, may be a square kiva within the room block. There was an incredibly nice, well-preserved plaster floor found during excavation that indicates that it might have been a special room used for special purposes. Additionally, the site this summer, they discovered that many of the rooms were burned when closed, and they seem to be cleaned out, and potentially the walls were even pushed over to seal these rooms when people were leaving the site and moving elsewhere. This is one of our students, Riley Duke, who will also be at the reception if you'd like to talk to him. He's been doing our projectile point analysis, so if you want to talk more about the points, he's the one to find. And he's very proud of his shirt actually having projectile points on them. Finally, our little bit of evidence for Pueblo IV occupation, because that's really what drove moving to this area, was to understand it in the context of homology research. And we were expecting to find a lot more influence and interaction with this time period. At the end of the day, we've actually found very little evidence of Pueblo IV use and occupation in the area. We had, up until 2 summers ago, I think we had maybe 2 or 3 yellow ware shirts under the whole region, and if you've ever been to the homology sites, you'll know that you can't really take a step without seeing more yellow ware. Surprisingly, it's fairly rare here. Where we do find it is concentrated again along Bell Cow and towards the steps. These often actually post-date the homology settlement cluster itself. They're frequently post-1400. There is a reference that Dukes discusses of speaking to a member of Hopi who says that they use Chevron Canyon for turtles and other ceremonial materials as a collection site. And this could indicate reuse and continuing visitation. There are petroglyphs that date to these later periods, but they're much less frequent, and they're fairly rare. The yellow ware that we do have is almost all small jars, and it's almost all seems to be a pot drop of some sort. This is our most complete. It was obviously very exciting for the students. I did not find this one. Claire and Chuck were with a bunch of students who I take it spent the next hour combing through the sand on the top of the dune. And Barney. Oh, nice. Excellent. And Barney. So they spent what I take to be a very long time trying to make sure they had every little piece. And conservation at ASM has done an amazing job and put it back together for us. So we will have that out at ASM as well if you want to look at it. See it again.